This is chapter 12 of Anglo Saxon Boy by Tony Bradman, and it is called Broken Hearts. A great roar of approval greeted the announcement, and men banged their fists on the table that ran in two lines down the length of the hall, or rose to their feet to offer toasts, clashing their drinking horns. The Earl was sitting at the top table with King Edward on one side, and Edwin and Morcar and Orgith on the other. Harold took her hand, and they rose to their feet to acknowledge the acclaim, both smiling. Magnus was with Hakon at a table halfway down the hall. He rose to his feet too, his jaws clenched so hard his teeth ached, his mouth like a knife wound slashed across his face, his eyes fixed on his father. He started to walk towards the top table, but Hakon saw where he was going and grabbed his arm to hold him back. "Sit down, Magnus," the housecarl hissed. "Don't do anything stupid." "Leave me alone," said Magnus, pulling his arm free. He kept going, right up the middle of the hall, between the tables, past cheering nobles and priests. Several slapped him on the back as he went past, shouting congratulations on his father's match, telling him he must be so proud to have such a great man for his father. Magnus said nothing, letting it all wash over him as he walked on. The smile faded from the Earl's face when he saw Magnus approaching. Magnus stopped in front of the top table, a few feet from his father, and looked at Orgith. She was younger than his mother, with black hair and pale skin and dark eyes, and she smiled as if she knew who he was. Her brothers were leaning together, laughing about something. Magnus ignored all three and turned back to his father. "What are you doing?" Magnus said, eyes locked on his father's. "First you betray your brother to his enemies, and now this!" He waved a hand in Orgith's direction. "You can't marry her. You're already married to my mother!" He screamed the last word, and the noise in the hall died away, replaced by a buzz of people whispering, asking each other what was going on. Orgith's smile disintegrated. Magnus felt a presence beside him, Hakon standing at his shoulder. "Go back to your bench, Magnus," the Earl said calmly, his face stony. "This is neither the time nor the place for a father and son to speak of such things." "Well, it seems like the right time to me, father," said Magnus, his voice shaking. "I want to hear you explain how you can just put aside my mother so easily." "Your father can do as he pleases," said Edwin, staring at Magnus with cold eyes. "Everyone knows it was only a hand fasting with your mother." "What are you talking about?" said Magnus. "I don't know what that means." "It means your parents' union was not blessed by the church," said someone further along the top table. Magnus saw it was Stigand, and that Eldred was sitting beside him. "So it can be dissolved when either the man or the woman decides." "And our wedding will be in the king's new church," said Orgith, glaring at Magnus now. "Archbishop Stigand himself will perform the ceremony." "Any other questions, boy?" said Morcar, leaning back in his seat, his rich tunic straining over his paunch. "Or can we get on with the feast? I'm starving." Magnus looked along the line of faces, all of them staring at him, although the king seemed confused by what was going on. Magnus wished he had his sword so he could cut off their heads, but weapons were banned at feasts in the king's hall. "Take him away, Hakon," said the Earl. "We will speak later, Magnus." "Come, Magnus," said Hakon. "We should go and sit down." Magnus turned on his heel and walked back through the hall, all eyes following him. But he didn't stop at the table where he and Hakon had been sitting. He kept on going and straight out of the hall, with Hakon hurrying to catch up. At dawn the next morning, Magnus left Thorney alone, heading for home. He spoke to no one for 3 days after he arrived, especially not his mother. Most of the time he spent hunting in the woods, although even when the hounds managed to track down a deer, he didn't have the heart to make a kill. But it was better to be doing something. Otherwise he might have to listen to the voice in his head that kept telling him he had been a fool, and that he should never trust his father again. His mother sought him out on the morning of the 4th day. He was sitting under his usual tree in the orchard, when he saw her climbing the slope towards him. It was cold, the sky a mass of dark clouds, the distant sea a flat sheet of grey, a soft wind whispering through the brown and yellow leaves around him. He thought briefly of trying to flee, but realised he had to talk to her eventually, and waited. "I thought I would find you here," she said with a smile, putting her cloak closer around her shoulders. the breeze blowing a skein of her golden hair across her face. "I know this is the place you go to when something is preying on your mind." Magnus looked up at her. "Did you know this wedding was going to happen?" he said, his voice sounding strange to him after his long silence. "Did he tell you?" "I only found out a little while before you did." She sat down beside him, her legs gracefully tucked beneath her. "But I always knew it would happen one day." "Well, I wish you'd told me that a long time ago," said Magnus, ripping up grass from the ground in front of him. "I'm still not sure I even understand it." "I'm sorry, Magnus, but I suppose it was something I didn't want to talk about." She looked down at the hall. "You know, even now I'm amazed I live in such a place. My family wasn't poor, but we weren't rich either, and families like the Godwins only marry their children to the children of other rich and powerful families. Properly marry, that is. A handfasting was the best I could ever hope for. But you've been together so long, and you gave birth to us, and I thought—" Magnus stopped, unable to continue. "Don't be too hard on your father, Magnus," his mother said softly. "He's marrying Algith because that's part of the price he has to pay for Edwin's support in his bid for the throne. Edwin wanted Tostig's earldom for his brother, and Algith to be queen if Harold succeeds Edward. In exchange, he pledged his loyalty to your father and promised to hold the north for him." Suddenly Magnus could see that Edwin was doing for his own family what Grandfather Godwin had done for his, and what his father was doing too. He was taking positions of power, building alliances, looking to the future. But it was strange to hear his mother talking about such things. Magnus had always thought of her as only being interested in her children and running the farm. She clearly knew a great deal more. "What of my Uncle Tostig, though? According to my father, the family must always come first. Yet he didn't help his own brother, did he? He betrayed him." "It's the whole family that counts for your father, not just one member of it. And because of Tostig, the family might have lost its chance to take the throne." They fell silent for a moment. The wind strengthened, whirling the leaves around them, breaking up the clouds and sending them scudding out over the sea. Magnus felt a hot wave of shame at the memory of what he'd said to his father about sending the housecarls to save Tostig, of how he had tried to behave like a grown man and tell his father what to do. It was no wonder the Earl had kept his plans from him. "And what about you, Mother?" he said. "Will you be all right? Your father is a generous man, Magnus. You are the Earl's children. This is your home, and as your mother I can live here until I die. But my heart is broken." Magnus thought his might be broken too, although he said nothing more. His mother held out her hand to him, and they walked down the slope together. The next day Magnus helped at the autumn slaughtering. The older and weaker beasts were killed, the steaming blood drained off to be made into sausages, the carcasses butchered and the meat salted to see the farm through the winter. The work was hard and joyless, the animals squealing in terror, but Magnus knew it had to be done, and there was pleasure in seeing the farm's food stores filling up. A week later Hakon arrived, riding into the courtyard as the sun was setting on a day that had been cold and wet. He jumped from his horse and walked up to Magnus, who was standing in the hall doorway. The two of them looked at each other. "It's good to see you, Hakon," said Magnus at last. "Are you here for a reason?" "Why, I've come to visit you, of course," said the housecarl with a smile. "I have some news for you as well. King Edward is finally coming to his end. He's been growing sicker for weeks, and the priests say he will be dead by Christmas." Edward lived through Christmas and died at the start of the new year. Magnus's father was with him, and said afterwards that Edward had named him as his successor. Some said that was a lie, and a great assembly of nobles and priests, the Witan, was called to resolve these mighty matters of state. They argued for a day and a night, but at last they came to a decision, and heralds were sent out all over the land. "King Edward is dead," they proclaimed. "Long live King Harold." Magnus was the son of a king, and he felt less important than ever.